Anka saw the lights coming all too late as her eyes snapped open. The impact, the rolling, the trees, the silence. And then there were the flashes, a mass of bustling noise, the flooding of faces around her. Straps, braces, blood and saline. The ride was jostling and bumpy. Where was she? Where was she going? She tried to remember in vain what had transpired that led up to this. What was happening to her? Her vision faded to black, and she was left in a room. A dark room with only a single light to comfort her. That one light made her feel less alone. Back to reality, a surging pain leapt through her. Clear! And again. Masked faces swarmed all over her, tearing at her clothes, prodding at painful places. She felt like she was falling apart. They've got a hell of a mess here. Call Dr. Porter and arrange OR immediately. A light shined in her eyes uncomfortably. Anka? Anka, can you hear me? The voice was muddled. She couldn't respond. She found herself falling again. Anka, squeeze my hand. The voice faded. The light. It was back again, filling a tiny halo in the mass of darkness. She took a step forward, and another. She smiled when the light followed. Are you an angel? Anka asked quietly, but the light did not respond. She took another step, unsure of where she should go or what she should do here. Far off in the distance, somewhere above her, she heard a cry. It sounded like her mother. There were words, but all she could make out was, "Please, baby." She blinked. She found herself unsure of everything. Was this real? She walked on. It seemed to go on forever, but the light followed. She could hear her bare feet pattering on the cool floor beneath. Bare feet, she thought. She looked down, and sure enough, her shoes were gone. What else was she missing? As it turned out, her clothes were gone as well, leaving her in a pale pink hospital gown. Hardly flattering, but at least she was covered. Voices murmured above her, words she couldn't make out clearly. She heard her mother crying, and one coherent word from a deep, echoing, baritone voice. Coma. Coma, she thought. Was it her? Was she in a coma? What was going on? She stopped walking and looked up. She saw only darkness. No one was there to make the voices. She was the only one, and that little light hovering over her. She didn't understand what was happening to her. How did she get here? She walked, seeing no other options. She found herself wondering if she was going in a straight line or if she was walking in circles, as she saw nothing, nothing at all. Farther and farther she went, like Alice down the rabbit hole, she thought. But just ahead, she saw something. She couldn't make out what it was just yet, but as she moved closer and closer, she could see a door. There was nothing else around it, no building that it led into, nothing. A simple oak door, like you would see in the front of a house. She wasn't sure if she should knock or just open it. She looked around it. Nothing. So she decided to do the polite thing, as ridiculous as it seemed, and knocked. But there was no response. Of course, how would there be from a door standing alone in the middle of literally nowhere? She decided what the hell and opened the door. She was blinded by a stark white room, lit up brighter than daylight. What the fuck? She thought. Wait, she never said fuck. What the hell was that about? Shielding her eyes from the blinding light, she stepped forward into the questionable room. She was greeted with streamers, music, and decorations fit for a college frat party. All around her, people danced and laughed and socialized. "Hi," a young man said over the music. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust, but when she saw him, she jumped back screaming. "What?" he said ignorantly. He then pointed to his face and gave an "oh duh" look to himself. Half of his face was ground off, nearly to the bone, with one eye swollen shut, patches of flesh dangling from his jaw. His head was ground down to the skull in some places, making his hair look patchy and awkward. The red scraped wounds traveled down his jaw, over the left side of his neck, shoulder, and from what she could tell, dropped down beneath his pale blue hospital gown to his chest. "Yeah, don't mind this. Motorcycle accident, drunk driver," he said nonchalantly. "Please come in. This is your welcome party. We put all this together for you." He put an arm around her shoulder, and she jumped slightly, still in shock. "It's okay, I promise. We're a good bunch," he assured her. She let him lead her to a clear glass bar near the center of the room, where she leaned over to catch her bearings. "My party?" she asked suspiciously. "Yep," the man said, bobbing his mangled head to the music. "We do it for all the newcomers, sort of get you acclimated." He took a sip of a bright red drink after he said it. She shook her head. "Acclimated to what?" He stopped then, turning slowly to look at her. "You don't know?" She stood exasperated. "Know what?" She noticed a couple approaching. The female seemed normal enough, but the male was a mess of broken limbs and bloodied meat. She had no idea how he was walking. "Ah, here comes Thomas and Diane. And I'm Curtis, by the way," he said, still bobbing and stepping to the music. "I'm confused," she responded. "Don't worry, sweetie, we all are in the beginning," Diane said as she approached, placing her hands gently on Anka's arms. "You're in a coma, dear, and it's nothing to be afraid of. We all are. You won't be alone through this. Most of us wake up eventually." "It's true," Thomas said through a dangling jaw. "What?" Anka trailed off. Diane looked at her companion and laughed out loud. "Oh, don't worry, dear. We had an accident. He was trapped beneath the van, and I was thrown through the windshield, but we're together, and that's all that matters to us," Diane explained. Thomas nodded in agreement and took a sip of punch. Anka was shocked to see he kept it down. I, I'm Anka," she said shakily. "It's so lovely to meet you, Anka," Diane said as she turned to grab at the crowd's attention. Anka was horrified at the sight that greeted her. Every ounce of flesh was missing from Diane's back. It was just spine, shoulder blades, and ribs, many of which were broken and displaced, all hugged together by the red, meaty substance that passed as muscle and tissue. Everyone, please, this is Anka. Please welcome her, as this is her celebration, Diane said loudly and began clapping as the rest of the room followed suit. Anka attempted to smile, but managed only a timid grin. Diane turned back to her and began pointing out those in the room around them. There, to your right, that's Stephen. The poor thing was shot by a man robbing a liquor store. She pointed out the young man, maybe mid-20s, with a hole in his head, big enough to watch television through. And there, that's Bella. She was abused by her husband for the longest time. Precious thing. He finally just picked up a bat one day and didn't stop until she went limp. Anka was mortified. Oh, and that's Clifford. Oh, but the sweetest man you could ever meet. Was a fisherman thrown overboard and adrift at sea for weeks before he was found. Heaven knows how he didn't drown. Anka saw a pretty blonde across the room that seemed to be fading in and out. Curtis noted her gaze and followed it. Oh no. Diane and Thomas saw it too, emitting the same response. What's wrong with her? Anka asked, worried. Curtis looked at her for a moment before responding. They pulled the plug. We won't be seeing her again. Fear choked her as she watched this young, vibrant, beautiful woman disappear before her. She wanted to cry. Is that what would happen to her? Would they just give up on her and pull the plug? What was her name? She asked, near tears. Cindy, said Curtis. Her name was Cindy. Anka made a solemn vow to herself to never, ever forget the pretty woman's name. She would remember her always. A tear streamed down her cheek, and pain caught like a whimper in her throat. It was the first time she had seen someone die. It wasn't what she expected. It hurt. The room fell silent. Anka looked up and saw everyone raising their glass in what was once pretty Cindy's direction. Don't feel so sad, love, Diane said. She is in a much better place now. Anka wondered if that were true. Would she be visiting that place too? She closed her eyes and shuddered at the thought. She couldn't help but wonder in that moment how many plugs had been pulled. It happens, dear, Diane said. And we're able to tell pretty easily who will wake up and who won't. Anka snapped to attention at that moment. Diane laughed, a melodic sound that caressed the soul. It made Anka smile. Don't worry your pretty self, Anka. You'll wake up. She comforted her. Anka smiled. As for Thomas and myself, well, we aren't so lucky. They will pull the plug someday, and when they do, we will be in that better place too, won't we, dear? She said, stroking the mangled flesh of Thomas's shoulder. He nodded happily. Well, what about Curtis? Anka asked. Will he... Anka trailed off, looking at Curtis. Diane and Thomas gave her a smile, tipped their glasses, and moved on to another crowd at the party. Anka eyed Curtis meaningfully. "Curtis, you will, won't you?" she said in a small voice. "Ah, kiddo, I don't want to wake up. If I did, I would have years ago. I just don't want to go back there. They'll unplug me someday, but I won't go back there," he said. "Why?" she asked. She wanted to know. Why would anyone not want to wake up? "Well," he started, "I don't have anyone up there. Don't know anyone. All my family's gone. My friends, they're all right here." He opened his arms to suggest those in the room. Anka frowned. "See, kiddo, you've got your mom, your dad, sisters, family, friends, a life to go back to, so you better get going," he told her matter-of-factly before rejoining the crowd. Before she could say anything, she was engulfed in light that smothered every inch of her. Startled, she bolted upright and began to cough. She looked around her in a panic, wondering where she was, what happened, where had everyone gone? Diane, Thomas, Curtis, what happened? She heard her mother's voice, felt her mother's gentle touch. She was rubbing her back. "It's all right, sweetheart, you're all right." "Mom?" Anka exclaimed and threw herself into her mother's embrace. After several weeks in recovery, Anka was ready to leave the hospital, but not before doing one last thing. She weaved through the coma patients one by one, striving to recognize a face. Anyone. Just to know it wasn't a dream. And at the very end of the room, in the very last bed, she saw it. An elderly man, probably upwards of 80, lay still in his bed, with his hands at his sides, a thick, mangled scar running from the top of his head down into his pale blue hospital gown. She gave him a small smile, placed a kiss on Curtis's cheek. "You have me," she whispered in his ear. She tucked his blankets in close to him, grasped his hand, and walked away.